Hi there poetry pals, welcome back to another video. This week I am making a video about lines, lineation and enjambment. We'll focus on the key words, techniques, the effects of those techniques, and also how we can use it in our own writing. And I also have a few examples to demonstrate to you what I mean. But before we go any further, please make sure you subscribe to my channel, give this video a like, and comment down below what brought you to this video in particular. And while we're on the subject, why don't you follow me on social media? I am at Josie Alford Poet on all the things. This video is part of my series of Back to Basics poetry. So far I've covered scansion and how to identify stressed and unstressed syllables. Then I covered meter and rhythm, and this one is about lines, lineation and enjambment, and we will grow through the basics of poetry as we go forward. So please subscribe if you're interested in getting nerdy about the particulars of poetry. So for this video I used two main books, Reading Poetry and The Poet's Manual. They're pretty good. Reading poetry is really useful if you're looking to analyse poetry. Doesn't give you as many useful techniques for writing poetry, but still very interested in learning all of the theory and really getting in on that theory. Whereas The Poet's Manual is better for writers. It basically defines different terms and leaves it at that, whilst also giving you the history of certain forms. So if you're looking for books to buy and read, these are the ones that I've used most in this thing. Okay, so first of all, we're just going to define a few key words here that are relevant for this conversation. First one, a line. What is a line? According to the Poet's Manual, a line is a unit of language in a poem, a group of words that stand together and usually appear in one line of type, though it may, if it is long, run over onto a second line. Makes sense, right? A line is one line of text, although if the line, as in the poetic line, is longer than the margin of the page, then it might run over, but it still counts as one line. The way we lay it out on the page shows that. I'll put up an example here. So then I want to teach you the phrase an end-stopped line. The end-stopped line is a line of poetry that expresses a complete thought without spilling over grammatically onto the next line. Another way of thinking about it is maybe that it uses a bit of punctuation here, but basically the complete thought or whatever ends with the end of the line. It does not run on. Speaking of which, let's talk about enjambment. So the meaning of this is enjambment is the running of one line onto the next to complete the meaning. So what that means is that the sentence or clause which you are saying is not completed on that one line. You need to go on to the next line to complete the thought, clause, sentence. Next up is run-on verse. In run-on verse, the thought runs in a series of lines, no one of which expresses a complete thought. The lines are characterised by enjambment. Enjambment. In run-on verse, the thought goes across multiple lines, not just two. This is a type of... The complete thought is not expressed on any one line. You need multiple lines to complete that thought or clause or sentence. So the next word I want to run through is caesura. This is one that I covered in my last video about meter and rhythm. And the caesura is a break in the flow of sound within a line caused by a break in the meaning, the end of one sentence and the beginning of another, for example, that contains a rhetorical pause in the reading of the line. In the context of meter and rhythm, a caesura is a pause or break that takes up one of the beats in a line. In the context of line breaks, we're talking about it more syntactically, talking about how the caesura is a break in the sentence. One more keyword I want to add, because I realised I didn't include it in my script, is syntax. If I use the word syntax or syntactically, all I'm talking about is the way words are put together to form phrases and sentences. It's basically the study of sentences. So the main things that fall under syntax is how we put those sentences together. So word order and grammar are like key parts of that. So bear that in mind as we go forward, because I'll be using the word syntax quite a lot. And when I do, I just mean how words are put together to make sentences or phrases. And finally, the last thing I want to teach you is free verse. Free verse is poetry that is not defined by rhythm or line length. This is far more common in contemporary poetry, and it's one of the ones where, because of that freedom, you're going to be using techniques for enjambment quite a lot if you are writing in free verse. On the other side of free verse, on the other side of that coin, we do have poetry that is defined by a regular rhythm or metre. Poems with specific metres will have a specific line length. This will apply if we're writing in traditional forms, and therefore where the line break falls will be predetermined by how many syllables, stressed or unstressed, that we have in that line according to what rhythm we're going for. For more information on what metre and rhythm means, you can watch my videos before in this series of my Back to Basics of Poetry. One thing that we've learned as we go through this basics of poetry is that poetry is all about the patterns of sound. That's repeated when it comes to rhythm and metre and that stressed and unstressed thing. And then we have the lines being of regular length, which just adds to the pattern of sound. This is reflected as well as if we have rhyming poetry and in these traditional poetic forms or poetry that's choosing to rhyme, we have end rhyme, which will be at the end of the line, and this is where the line break will happen. The line break thus bringing attention to the rhyme as well. Okay, so we've run through some really basic terms of some words and phrases that you need to understand, but now I want to read you a definition of what makes a poem a poem. Clue, this is a video about lines, line breaks and enjambment, so let's see what reading poetry has to say on the subject. We cannot ignore the fact that poems are organised according to rhythmic and metrical principles, aka the patterns of sounds that I was just talking about. Such principles are the reason why poetry is laid out on the page the way that it is. That is, in lines whose length is governed not by the margins of the page, as in prose, but according to a design predetermined by the poet. The visual and audible difference. Hearing poems out loud is different to hearing prose read out loud as well. Anyway, back to their definition. The visual difference between poetry and prose is not simply a trivial fact that we can note and then ignore. Instead, it is the first signal that a reader is likely to register that they are confronted by a poem rather than some other kind of written language. The spatial layout of lines on a page says to the reader, this is poetry, and is likely to affect the way they read words which are organised this way. They're basically saying that lines are part of what makes a poem, and that lineation is a key part of making that a poem. If you do not have line breaks, it is not a poem. But what about prose poetry? Great question. Reading poetry says that prose poems are oxymoronic and are actually, in fact, merely poetic prose. I would argue it's not that simple. I could make an entire video about what makes a poem, and if this video gets to 50 likes, I will absolutely do that. This is something that we covered when I was studying for my undergrad. We spent 2-3 whole weeks of our first year defining what made a poem, and let me tell you, we did not do it. To this day, degree, masters, right now, I could not give you a succinct definition of what makes a poem, but I can tell you right now that I do believe that prose poetry is poetry. For now, I will say that line breaks are more like guidelines than actual rules, to quote Barbosa from Pirates of the Caribbean. And these guidelines can absolutely be broken. Prose poetry is just an example of poetry that doesn't obey the rules, which happens pretty much every single time we do anything. This guy broke loads of rules. Anyway, Back to the line breaks video. We can do a video about what makes a poem another time, but let me tell you, I'm not going to be drinking tea out of my cup for that one. Reading poetry goes on to say, what is really interesting about poetry is the way a particular poem exploits the potential effects of lineation in combination with other formal and figurative devices. I think this is a key thing about why people find poetry interesting and why I personally really enjoy analysing written poems. It is harder to do with spoken word because listening to spoken word is a temporal experience that by all means you could watch a YouTube video over and over and over, but the act of really getting into all of the little choices that a poet makes and really getting into it is easier with written poetry. And I think that's what is what makes poetry interesting. I would argue that what makes poetry or any writing interesting is how the writer exploits the rules to create effect. So we're going to have a look now as to the particular effects that can be used from line breaks specifically. How can we, as writers, exploit the potential effects of lineation? Okay, so I'm going to run through 4 techniques that we can use line breaks for. First up is the phrase double pattern. In language, as I said earlier, we have the pattern of syntax, or how we build sentences, how we communicate normally. Right now, I am using words in a particular order that makes sense using syntax so that you can understand what I'm saying. In poetry, that pattern breaks a little bit because one of the other things that we play with is the pattern of sound and repeating sounds, noises, stressed, unstressed, rhyme, whatever. We have these 2 patterns. Double pattern is when you play one off the other. How the sentence structure and the structure of the lines play off each other to make different effects. This is essentially the relationship between form and meaning. And I think this is particularly something that poetry in general is very strong with, is you take the form in which you are writing and the meaning and you make them work with each other or against each other to create effect. Another phrase I want to teach you, which is related to double pattern, is double syntax. Double syntax describes what happens when the reader is uncertain how to construe the sentence structure when it flows over a line ending. The syntax becomes double when the word or phrase at the line ending can be taken as belonging grammatically with what comes before or what comes after. This is a super cool technique to use as writers, and it's something that I personally enjoy using quite a lot and something that I enjoy seeing in poetry that I read as well. What it creates is this moment of hesitation where when you are reading a poem, especially for the first time, you get to the end of the line and there is this moment's pause where you think that that is the end of the clause until your eyes move to the next line and you realise that the next line is a continuation of that thought. This beautiful moment of hesitation and being aware about how we can use that as writers and being aware of it as readers is what I think is the sweet spot. And I think that is what you're aiming for if you're aiming to use lineation to create an effect. I've got an example here. This is one of my poems that I actually wrote for this YouTube channel, my video on how to write a rhymed Sistina. I'll make it pop up here. To give you a very quick idea of what a Sistina is, it is defined by certain words being repeated at the end of each line. A Sistina is a really interesting one to play with as poets if we're looking to up our game and sharpen our swords when it comes to playing with lineation and enjambment. So I will link to both my how to write a Sistina and how to write a rhymed Sistina down below. But I'm going to read you the first few lines of my poem. If Lockdown 3 were a poem, it would be a rhymed Sistina. For the third time, we are trapped behind walls of our own making, trying to fit ourselves back inside, shrinking into video calls and trying not to think about how long it will last. Guarded against hope, the rain falls, and lockdown is the same but more shit. I want to particularly draw your attention to the first and second line because this is an example of double syntax. Quick side note, I'm acknowledging how weird it is to analyse my own poems in front of you, but we're doing it, okay? So buckle up, buckaroo. Let's analyse my own poem just quickly. So when you're first reading it, it just reads as, for the third time we are trapped behind walls. And that in itself is a complete thought. It works, that can make sense. But actually there is no punctuation on the line. The thought, the phrase continues to of our own making. What is interesting here is we have this moment of hesitation after the word walls, which I had to use at the end of the line because Sistina. That moment of hesitation allows that moment to sink in of yes, for the third time we are in lockdown again, we are trapped inside our own house again. But the thought continues to of our own making. Now, that moment of hesitation becomes a moment of discomfort between these two phrases, which is why the title of this entire poem is If Lockdown 3 Were a Poem, It Would Be a Rhymed Sistina, because writing rhymed Sistinas is really hard and living through Lockdown 3 was really hard. You see where I'm going with this? Anyway, the of our own making, because it falls after this moment of hesitation, it sort of highlights this sort of like mental of our own making, like we're trapped behind walls of our own brains, but it is also of our own making because as a country, oh, didn't we f*** about at Christmas? Didn't we mess around at Christmas and spread some more COVID around so we all had to go into lockdown again? Didn't we do that? Wasn't this whole situation of our own making? We'd like it to just be the first line of, ugh, we're trapped behind walls again, because that takes the responsibility off of us, but the second line brings it in being like, no pals, this is our fault. Moving on! Concrete poetry. Concrete poetry is the literal translation of form reflecting poetry. It is using lineation to shape your words into an actual shape. Here is an example. This poem is called The Swan. It is in the shape of a swan. This is what concrete poetry is. If I can find where this poem is online, I'll link it down below. It's a really nice example and I definitely encourage you to read it further. But the fact is that in the first couple of lines where we're going down the swan's neck, we have the effect of it being short, staccato, quick lines. And then as we go further down into the body, and the water, we have these long flowing, we have these long flowing lines, and then it comes back to narrow again with the reflection of it. Next up, we're going to talk about line breaks as punctuation. Some poets, especially like postmodern poets and contemporary poets, do not use punctuation in their poetry. This is something that spoken word poets do quite a lot when transferring their performances onto the page. This can be useful in creating an effect, but one thing I do want to say is that if you are going to go for a poem that has no punctuation, you've got to really be on it with conveying your meaning. The fact is that we use syntax, grammar and punctuation to be clear of our meanings. We've all seen those weird memes on Facebook which is like, punctuation is the difference between knowing your shit and knowing your shit. Not using punctuation in a written poem can be really useful in creating effects. I think it's very useful in creating this sort of disorientating thing. It's also good at creating a sort of like rebellious thing. It can depend on what your topic is that you might want to use or not use punctuation. If you're going for a non-punctuated poem though, you can then use lineation or even stanza breaks as punctuation. A great example here is This Is Just to Say. This is a really short and simple poem that's been made into memes and stuff like that so many times, but it says, "This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold." What's really cool about the lack of punctuation here is that it leaves the reader to put in the pauses where they want to. You can see when I read it out loud the first time that I didn't actually pause much in the first two stanzas at all. I took the first stanza to be like one clause with a comma, then the second stanza, but I paused a lot more in the second one to add emphasis to it. If we did pause for every line break as if it was a comma, this is how it would sound though. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. I think one thing to pay attention to in this poem is which words and phrases are left on their own because of line breaks. Forgive me is on its own line. It really, when you're reading it on the page, you really sort of just see the words forgive me surrounded by white space and it makes them stand out. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the effect of line breaks and lineations. So, reading poetry says that line endings are the place where the relationship between a poem's metre and its meaning most often become apparent. This comes back to this moment of hesitation at the end of lines, this pause, which is significant even in free verse. Line endings are significant because this is also where rhyming happens. Or at least end rhymes happen a lot in English poetry, so the rhyming happening at the end of a line is more significant too. This also plays into this idea of double pattern even more. We've got the rhyme, we've got the rhythm, we've got the syntax, we have double pattern. Two words being at the end of lines, like consecutive lines, can highlight their relationship. This can be a similarity or a difference. Again, a lot of these effects are referring to when you are reading written poetry rather than when you're speaking it. When we are speaking, the way we draw attention to certain words works in slightly different ways. So we have pauses, we have volume, we have stressed and unstressed syllables. So how can we use all of this information that I've covered in our own writing? Well, line endings are particularly important in written poetry. A line break naturally places an emphasis at the end of lines with that moment of hesitation. So have a think about how you can use that moment to add focus to certain words or add confusion as well if you're playing with double syntax, for example. So here's some tips. Bear these techniques in mind when you're laying your poetry out on the page. This is particularly relevant for spoken word poets who are maybe looking to start publishing their poems, or they're pulling it all together for a book. It can be very easy just to write it down the way you had in your notebook for performance. But actually, when you're going through this process, it's a really cool opportunity for you to sit down and actually really have a think about where you want that hesitation, that moment of hesitation, that moment of emphasis or confusion. You can have a think about that. This is also relevant if you write your poems like I do. I always start with a free write and then arrange my favourite words and phrases on the page, but I don't necessarily write line breaks in straight away. You want to think about what you want to highlight and also look for any opportunities for double syntax. Depending on how you write, it is important for you to think about it when you write, but I think it's also most specifically relevant for when you are editing, especially if you're editing each other's poems. Like say someone's asked you for feedback, you can really get into their line breaks and go, actually, do you know what, I think it might be stronger if you break the line here because it lets us add some emphasis to this word. Also, if you are writing in a strict form like a sonnet or a Sistina or a villanelle or whatever it is, you don't think that you can get away without thinking about lineation and enjambment. The words that fall at the end of the line, rhymed or not, are significant, so play around with that anyway. And to be honest, I find using enjambment when looking at regular poetry forms to be the most useful way of helping to make it flow. Especially with something like a Sistina or a pantoum, where you have a very strict form with a lot of repetition. Using enjambment and allowing you to use those words in different ways can be really freeing. So absolutely use these techniques when it comes to writing in regular forms. My final tip for how to use this information in your own writing is to practice, practice, and practice. That's the only way you're going to get used to using these techniques. And I also think going back to your old poems and looking at how they're out on the page and playing around with editing them is a great way of practicing and sharpening these tools in your kit. So I asked on my YouTube community page, by the way, if you're not subscribed, first of all, rude. Second of all, subscribe so you can ask me questions. So I asked on my YouTube community page if anyone had any particular questions about enjambment and line breaks. And the first question I got was, how do you personally read line breaks? Can they be both visual cues for pauses and visually pleasing, or should they be almost ignored when reading aloud? I think I'm sorry to almost not answer this, but the answer is it really depends on the rest of the poem, particularly the presence of punctuation. As I was talking about, line breaks can be used as punctuation, and if there isn't any punctuation already existing in the poem, then the line breaks start to inform my pauses a lot more. But to be clear, this is how I would prioritise my pauses. Joint first is stanza breaks and full stops. I think full stops ahead of stanza breaks actually. I've just thought of a couple of examples in my own poems where I use enjambment across a stanza break. It's basically like a line break but even bigger. I'm going to do one all about stanzas next time, but stanzas are basically the verses, right? You know. So yeah, I'd argue that full stops are the most important, and that's definitely where I pause. Now, right next to that is stanzas. At the very least, it's a hefty moment of hesitation. Then we've got other punctuation. I'm talking semicolons, colons, commas, you know. And then we have at the very bottom line breaks. When you're reading a poem for the first time, you're going to naturally pause on the line break anyway. So I say when you're reading a poem for the first time, I mean when you're reading someone else's poem out loud. Like, for example, you're in English class and someone asks you to read the poem out loud, which quite frankly is rude. But you will have that moment of hesitation, and I personally enjoy that moment when I'm reading a poem for the first time, which is why a lot of the time, even when I'm reading poetry to myself, I will read it out loud to myself as well. But beyond the first time, if I get the chance to practice reading a poem out loud, whether that's with my poetry or someone else's poetry, I like to play around with the pauses and find out what works best. I think what's interesting about reading poetry out loud is that it is almost an act of translation. You're translating what is these marks on a page to sounds coming out of your mouth. And it's particularly interesting when you're reading another person's poem out loud, is you get to be part of that creative process of translation, and you get to decide where you're going to put the pauses in and stuff like that. I know of spoken word performers who will pause and stuff on their own poems in different ways to allow for different meanings and emphases to arise depending on the performance. So in answer to your question, it depends, and I just go with what feels right. The other question I got was, is there ever an improper use of enjambment? asking for a friend? I think this is a fantastic question, and I would have to answer yes, there is absolutely improper makes it sound offensive, but I just mean bad. I think that when you're playing with line breaks and enjambment, punctuation or anything, the thing you are playing with is the coherency of the poem. And sometimes enjambment can create more confusion than it should, and a poem can be let down, or the meaning of a poem can be obscured by the enjambment. I think that using enjambment is great, and I think that everyone should get used to using it. I don't think it necessarily always has to be intentional, but I do think the effect that it creates should be intentional. So you really need to be, especially when you are putting your words on a page, your reader, your potential audience is going to be spending a lot more time with your poem than they are if you're performing it out loud. And so you really need to make sure that the meaning that you want them to pull from your poetry is getting across. I'm not saying this as a be really simple and easy to understand. I'm just saying that make sure that the meaning that you are wanting to get across, or the sense that you are trying to get across, is there. If you're using enjambment in a bad way, as with using any poetic technique in a bad way, it can distract from the point you want to make. Now, we could go into a whole argument about how everyone interprets poetry differently, and that actually going for a meaning is wrong and we shouldn't even try, because meaning doesn't lie with us. Because of Roland Barthes and Death of the Author, we can't actually talk about that, and meaning only lies with the reader. But we're not talking about that right now. This video is far too long anyway. Basically, yes, there are bad examples of enjambment. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but the way that we can all get better at it is practice, 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 sending our poems to other people to read and make sense of, and reading it through ourselves, saying it out loud, and trying our best. So that's it for this week's video. I hope you found this week's video on lineation, line breaks and enjambment useful. Please make sure you subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Comment down below your favourite use of line breaks in poetry, and follow me on social media. I am at Josie Altford Poet on all the things, and I will see you all next week for a video. By the way, literally this evening I'm off to a naturist campsite for a week. I've never been and tried naturism. What does one pack to naturist camping? I don't know, but I can tell you I'm going to make a video of it, so please subscribe and I'll see you next week.